to Cosmic Confluence Podcast. I'm your host Sana, and today's conversation it takes us into a space where science and spirit meet, where the measurable meets the mysterious. Now, in Western medicine, we are trained to look at the body, the labs, the science, or the scans. But what about the dimensions we cannot see? The emotional, energetic, and even spiritual imprints that shape our health? Well, my guest has spent over 4 decades practicing medicine and has seen firsthand that many illnesses they don't show up on tests, yet they profoundly affect people's lives. From debilitating headaches to irritable bowel, these medically unexplained symptoms often carry an emotional root that our current systems struggle to acknowledge. So, today we are going to explore how the Gratefully Well model bridges neuroscience with the non physical dimensions of being and why this integration might be the missing link between or in modern healing. So, listeners, meet my lovely guest, my incredible guest, Julius Torelli. So, Julius, welcome to the show, and it's really an honor to have you back again with us.
Thank you, Sana. And it's an honor to be on the show. And that introduction was wonderfully articulated.
Yeah, I mean, it's really sometimes it's kind of uh, taken as a myth or sometimes portrayed as mysterious. But before we try to understand, Julius, what exactly is the status quo and what are the solutions ahead? What can we do? Why do you think the scenarios like this? Why do you think there are still dimensions that we cannot see? The reasons we cannot, see on our lab tests or reports or scans.
Yeah, well, not unfortunately. I think maybe the best way to think about this, or for at least the way I think about it, is that if you go back in history, we have, let's call them traditional forms of medicine, ancient Chinese medicine, Ayurveda in the East, and things like that. And there even shamanic sort of things in North America, but there was there wasn't any science sort of, backing there, and so, you know, somewhere in the late 1800s, William Osler, who's considered sort of the father of modern Western medicine, sort of made a proclamation that we as physicians and medicine needed to follow the scientific technique, scientific
Okay.
principles. And that made all the sense in the world, and to a large degree, it still makes sense. But I think had he known what would have happened because of that statement, he may have articulated it a bit different. He may have modified it a little bit. And the issue with it is there's no system that's perfect. We like to be science based, of course, but the problem with that is that in science, in order to for something to be scientifically proven, it has to be measured. And so what has happened is we have um, gone along the direction of things that we can easily measure in the body or in healthcare. So if you look at, common things like blood pressure, like
Mhm.
cholesterol level, like blood sugar and glucose, right? Things like that, thyroid, many things that we can measure. Those are and those are all physical sort of aspects, right? And so what we've become very good at looking at these physical dimensions of health. In addition, all of these things, whether you're talking about mental health or emotional or behavioral, and those other aspects of health, ultimately, when there's dysfunction there, they manifest physically. And so you put all that together, and you can see how that happened. Now, the challenge, of course, then is that okay, with these, as you described, medically unexplained symptoms, like I use migraine headaches and irritable bowel as the two poster childs for that,
Mhm.
where it puts us, as you know, most people who come into the physician's office with headaches or belly pain, um, have, um don't have brain tumors, they don't have appendicitis, and they don't have a physical cause of their pain. But yet the
Okay.
pain is real. The pain can be debilitating, it can be disabling, even. Migraine headaches can be miserable. Irritable bowel can be very, debilitating for people.
Yes.
And so again, in Western medicine, you can see the physical, and so the first thing we do if you come in with a migraine headache is to see, is there do you have a brain tumor as an example, which could be causing the headache, because you don't want to miss that. Now, you don't necessarily need an MRI to know if there's a brain tumor. You can do physical exam and look for neurologic findings and things like that. But regardless, you're still going to rule out. Someone comes in with chest pain, you want to rule out. Make sure they're not having a heart attack first. Make sure they have an unstable angina, heart disease, things like that. So that's key because if even if there might be some emotional component there, if they're in the middle of a heart attack, that's not the time to deal with those emotional sort of things. Right. And
Yeah.
so you would go ahead and rule out the physical things. The truth is, when you do that, you look at all doctor visits, the great majority of symptoms that people come in with, we do not ever find anything physically.
Oh, yeah.
Depending on the study you look at, that the number varies, but it's the majority of the visits. And so again, in Western medicine, doctors, nurses want to help, right? And so, as we've talked about before, in our Western medicine toolbox, you open up the toolbox to fix things, and the first tray is procedures. So if you have a brain tumor, you might need surgery. If you have appendicitis, you might have to belly pain and appendicitis, you might have to, take out your appendix. If you come in and we don't find a brain tumor, appendicitis, or something else physical, then you take out that procedure tray, and then the only thing left in the toolbox are pharmaceutical. And so, because physicians want to help and such, then we start with pharmaceuticals. And those are, again, from a scientific standpoint, you can do studies and show people with migraine headaches, I've got this pill and I could
Mhm.
show that it works better than a placebo. Remember, placebos are effective. Well, maybe we'll get into that, but
Mhm.
and so you have to show that your medicine works better, than a placebo. And so there are good medicines today that help prevent migraines. There are good medicines that treat migraines if you get a migraine. So those might be appropriate medicines. There's not anything wrong with the medicine. The problem is, and from my standpoint, is that everyone would generally agree that there is emotional basis, an emotional foundation to the headache or even to the irritable bowel. So in the West, we would call that stress. I like to think of
Mhm.
it more as an emotional component. But
Mhm.
regardless, the same thing. And the problem with the medicines is that they don't address that foundational component. And so if you look
Mhm.
at there are studies too to look at of all these stress related disorders, how often do patients get some kind of counseling, some kind of, psychologic therapeutic kind of counseling? And it's actually, I mean, the last study I saw was 3%. Uh,
Wow,
it's
that's
very small.
less.
So that's a very long-winded answer, I think, to I think maybe what you were getting at.
No, no, of course. I think it's quite difficult to summarize everything in such a short time because this goes like decades back or centuries back. And I also completely agree with you, Julius. When we talk about science, we always talk in terms of data, evidence, numbers, something that we can see. And you know, s- something really kind of I really wonder, like, do you believe that this resistance it comes more from science lacking language for the non-physical or from a culture that fears, what can't be measured?
I think it's both, and because you could still do studies, psychosocial studies, right? But they're very difficult to do. So we have studies, for instance, I use a lot of gratitude as a tool, and there's a lot of studies on, the benefits is on gratitude, the physical and mental health benefits of gratitude. So, but they're difficult to do. It's hard to measure that. You do studies on depression, let's say. Yes, you can measure, you can develop surveys to measure depression, things like that, but it's very difficult. Much easier to just measure blood pressure or blood sugar or
Yeah.
something like that. And so, and then in addition, there's also some social stigmata to all of this, right? Because, if you're, let's just say you have headaches and they're debilitating and you don't find anything, there's also this, well, they think it's all, I don't have a cause, so it's all in my head. There's an
Yeah.
unconscious sort of belief, right, that I'm doing this to myself essentially. And, I'd rather it be something else, because it's interesting when you look at patients who come in, unless you again stick with headaches, people come in and they've got migraines, they're debilitated, they're really miserable. And let's just say you do an MRI and it's normal, and you tell them it's normal. Their first, if you watch very closely, like the first reaction is almost disappointment because you didn't find anything, right? And so I had to learn very early, that after I would tell them your MRI is normal, again, as an example, then I would have to follow it up very quickly with, and that's a good thing. You would don't want us to find anything because if we find something, trust me, when we do an MRI of your head and we find something, it's generally not a good thing. Right?
Yeah.
And so, but there's that, that little bit of now at disappointment, like, oh, so now there's nothing to cut out. There's nothing you can do. So I think it's a knowing, an unconscious knowing that I'm doing this to myself. And so, and then of course, the other problem is to get to that, the patients are going to have to do some kind of, let's call it work, right? Some kind of work on themselves, some kind of, developmental kind of work, which is, it's easier to take a pill than to look at, your, subconscious and your unconscious and see what it is that you're doing to yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that is something natural, and there's nothing wrong in that because that's how um, we have been wired. And I think that feeling that you mentioned, that if in case we are not able to find anything in the scan, or we are not able to find any kind of tangible reason in there, that kind of is very disappointing, because then once again our we get into that rabbit hole of okay, maybe I am wrong or something is wrong with me, which even doctors cannot tell, nobody can understand me. I think this perspective itself, it strengthens the fact that their suffering is real, even if the scan looks normal.
Yeah, and again, I think, in communicating to patients, I think, which physicians, I think, in on average do poorly. We're poor communicators, which it's another it's another podcast. But we should be the best at communicating. But anyway, um, but getting that across to people, right? Uh,
Mhm.
is it can be challenging, but I think part of it relates again to the fact that they sort of know now, like, that I don't know how else to put it except I'm doing this to myself, right? But it's an unconscious sort of knowing. It's not necessarily something they think of in that sort of way. And also, it would be if you're having belly pain and you have appendicitis, yes, you might have to go through surgery, but you know that that's gonna fix it, you know what I mean? Whereas if you don't find anything, now it's kinda like, well, there's nothing to fix, now what? And so there's an unknown there, and becomes challenging for people.
Yeah, it does. It does. And I want to bring in here, first of all, um, do you think that, you mentioned about the communication in there, like, how physicists, sorry, I mean, physicians or doctors, they can communicate this to patients. And do you think that is something which is lacking in the education system, or the way, doctors or physicians are trained? Or is it something that is intentionally not uh, being taken care of?
That's again, we could have a whole podcast
Exactly.
on this, but I think again, w I it's a multifactorial problem. and and partly, it's the way we screen for physicians in the United States, at least. It's usually the top of the class. And
Yeah.
truth is, if you look at just grades of the people at the top of the class, most of those people are very introverted type of individuals. They don't, necessarily interact well. They don't have great inherent, natural sort of communication skills. I've told you before, you're very good at communicating, right? That's something that's come natural to you. But for a lot of these people, if you just look at, okay, we're just going to take people with the highest grades, those tend to, so we're screening for people that don't necessarily communicate well. And then secondly, we don't really teach communication. The communication we teach is to get the information. It's not really to interact with the patient. It's not how to be empathetic and things like that. And so, um, and then we stick with the physical, and we're just in as a whole, physicians just aren't very good with it. And so I would love to see, and medical schools have gotten better since, I was in medical school. I graduated in 1986 from medical school. So I think things have changed a little bit, but not dramatically so, not enough that as much as it needs to.
Yeah, yeah. That I think that so much makes sense, Julius. I don't know about others, but personally, I also feel um that really really makes sense, really, because patients, they're looking up to these doctors and physicians. These are threatening or life saving situations, and even a single word, it can make so much difference in there. Um,
It's not even the word only, it's even the way the word is said.
said, yeah,
Right,
yeah.
and physicians, I mean, it's hilarious when I look back and when I listen to things physicians say, when they get a test that's normal, right? And the patient says, "Well, what did my echocardiogram look like?" And they look and, "Ah, it looks pretty good." Well, it looks pretty good is very different from normal to a patient, especially when they're
Yeah.
hanging on every word. You know what I mean? What do you mean pretty good? Pretty good doesn't mean normal. It and so it's again, patients hang on every word the physician's saying and how they say it, and they watch your face and they watch your energy, and so physicians, I think, need to be cognizant of that, but again, we don't. The other thing is it's an issue is, especially again in the US is, physicians have gotten very busy. They can spend very little time. And what I would call pharmaceutical based physical medicine is very easy. Like you go in, you've got, the lab results, or the nurse is taking the blood pressure, say your blood pressure is too high, your cholesterol's too high, your sugar's too high. I'm going to put you on these three medicines and I'll see you back in 3 months. And that's the visit, right? You don't have to say, your sugar's high. Let's talk
Mm.
about, diabetes is a lifestyle. Yes, you have a genetic component to it, but it's a lifestyle issue as well. Let's talk about what's going on in your life, not just from a physical standpoint about what you're eating and how much you're exercising and stuff, but also what's the stress like in your life? What is the emotional stuff? That opens up a whole can of worms that you can't really do in 10 minutes, which is usually what you have for, a patient visit or something like that. So it's become, a bit of an issue, and people are starting to look at for these answers outside of the traditional healthcare system.
Mm, mm. Okay, and you mentioned about the gratefully well model. Although we have touched upon it in our previous shows, but let me bring it back again into the limelight here. Now, this model, it weaves neuroscience with these deeper dimensions. So, if you can walk us through how this approach can help someone make sense of their illness.
It, it all started for me literally 39 years ago. Let's call it 40 years ago. In my last week of medical school, when I was doing a family practice rotation, and a patient came in with, long story, but basically came in with intractable nausea, vomiting, and dry heaves for 3 days. She was dehydrated. We put her in the hospital. We hydrated her up. We did a bunch of tests. They all came back normal. And, um, and when I went to discharge her, basically she told me that, um, you know, over the last 6 weeks, her husband had left her, her dog died, and her house burned down. And it hit me. It was again, this was I think that point was about 2 days before I was graduating, and that hit me like, um, it became intuitively obvious to me why she was sick, but yet I hadn't learned anything about that in my medical school education. And so I thought maybe I'll learn about it in my training in internal medicine and cardiology. I didn't learn anything about it there either. And so as my practice evolved, it became more and more increasingly obvious to me that there are certain things in Western medicine that we do well, and those are usually, again, where we find something physical, and there are things we don't do well. And I think what gratefully well is for me is this missing, what I like to think of as a missing component in Western medicine, and that is addressing these non-physical issues. So again, don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's a lot of things in Western medicine that we do very well. Usually they're physically based kind of things, but there are some things where we kick a brick, and those are the more chronic things where we don't find anything, these medically unexplained symptoms, or just chronic disease in general. We aren't nearly as effective as we are with when we do find something physical. And so Gratefully Well tries to fill that, looking at once you rule out the physical, then to start to look at these other, what I like to think of as mental health, emotional health, behavioral health, social health, spiritual health, even cultural sort of aspects to health. And so Gratefully Well tries to basically look at that and address that.
Hmm. So it's like, it's holistic. It's I think the good thing here is that it's not abandoning science. It's also appreciating the physical aspect of, if we talk especially around about Western medicine, but at the same time, it's also giving people a fuller map of their health, not only physically, but mentally or emotionally as well. Because I also, I mean, through my experiences also, I have come to realize that, they are so much intricately connected. I mean, the worst health complications have happened to me when I have had burnt out or in my childhood, in my working, in my corporate phase, or when something personally devastating, event happened to me. It kind of also distorted my energy levels in there, and that showed up in different, um, aspects, more into symptoms, maybe blood pressure or sometimes headaches as well, or sometimes, gastric issues, digestive issues. So, yeah, I think a lot of listeners will also, agree with it that yes,
Yeah.
something that is tangible, at least the meaning in there is tangible.
Yeah, and I think, one of the things I try to do with Gratefully Well is to try to, um, use simple explanation or simple, examples of the power of mindset. What we not don't emphasize enough in Western medicine. We understand the placebo effect. The placebo effect is all a mindset effect, right? So for people who don't know, placebo effect is a sugar pill effect where you give a sugar pill for someone who's not feeling well and they get better somewhere between about 15 to 30% of the time. And and we know that exists. In Western medicine, we acknowledge that, we know it exists. We don't like to think about it too much. We think about it as a bit of a nuisance, maybe even. Uh, but it shows the power. The placebo effect is a great example of showing the power of mindset. But I think even if you take it down even further and you just think of thoughts, and how powerful a thought can be on changing the physiology of the body. And the easiest way to do that is to think of when you get scared, right? Or startled about something. And so if you're, going to sleep at night or you're asleep and you hear a noise downstairs and you wake up and you think, something happened, someone broke into your house or something happened, and you get startled, right? There are physical measurements, there's changes in your physiology that can be measured. So your heart rate is increased, your blood pressure increases, your pupils dilate, your palms get sweaty. Uh, those are very powerful physiologic changes. And what happened? You go downstairs, you find out something fell and made that noise, so no one broke in, but it was the thought, right, of someone having broke in, and you can amplify that thought, and so it can those and then so the thought it's the thought that changed the physiology. We understand the neuroscience behind that. Right. And so if you take all that into effect and you start to think, okay, well, what if I'm startled all the time? What if I'm afraid all the time because, I'm worried at work, I hate my job, or I'm always worried about getting fired, I don't make enough money, and I'm worried about how I'm going to make ends meet, and whatever it is, right? That's that constant, those are thoughts, those
Mhm.
worries, right? And those constant thoughts, again, changes the neurotransmitters and the hormonal effects that those have on your body. And then over time, that can manifest itself as chronic illness. It manifests as inflammation, which all chronic illness is inflammatory in nature. And so if you start there and get people to, because they can't deny that, right? But we don't talk about that in medicine. We don't talk about how powerful a belief is or a thought is, right? Because we think of that as too airy fairy or woo woo or whatever it is. But I think again, you can with the neuroscience, that neuroscience has really changed over the recent years, less than 20 years, with things that we have, like all the new testing, functional MRI, and all this kind of stuff, really can now begin to show that you can show the brain changes that occur with thoughts or with meditation or with, mindfulness or things like that. So we're starting to get evidence there as well. So if you start there, that I think helps people begin to understand, hey, that
Mhm.
there is some basis here, and then maybe things that you can do about that.
Totally, totally. I think that really explains very clearly, listeners, very, very clearly. And Julius, do you see a future where these non-physical dimensions, they are formally researched, they are taught in medical schools, or will they have to be always be there on margins? I mean, I'm really in favor of actually, you know, getting them taught in medical schools. At least, not even medical schools. I think at least in the high school or maybe the advanced, at advanced levels, specializations or maybe more and more research into this.
I think so. Again, because, testing has advanced so much, and functional MRI is a great example, right? Because again, functional MRI shows the changes that occur in the brain with different therapies, whether it's a drug or whether it's meditation or whether it's a thought, whether it's mindfulness, whether it's some kind of stressful thing. You can now actually see this on an MRI. 10 years ago or 20 years ago, I don't know exactly when functional MRI came around, but we couldn't do that. And so I think we're going back to the science. Like, I personally don't need evidence to show that gratitude is beneficial, but but there is evidence out there that shows it. And so it is nice. And so I think meditation is a great example, right? Like, everyone, we've sort of known meditation is beneficial, but it takes time. And in the West, no one has enough time. And so, we don't sort of, everyone doesn't espouse to it necessarily. But if you start to show, hey, look at these effects, and maybe you start to compare it to a blood pressure medicine. I'll just use blood pressure as an example. Hey, the effect of a blood pressure medicine in hypertension versus meditation, then, people will start to sort of see the power of these unconscious or subconscious thoughts and beliefs, minds. And
Yeah.
I think it's just easier to think of it as mindset.
Mm, absolutely, absolutely. Great, great. And of course, Julius, if our listeners, they would like to get started on this, take the first steps in there and trying to understand why this is important to consider, or at least, have that clarity, have that openness to accept it. Um, how they can connect with you, how they can get access to your resources.
So I have a website, gratefully well.com, that's got a 7-day gratitude challenge. The website is new, so it's a little bit limited right now. Also have a newsletter on substack.com that's called Gratefully Well. It's a free newsletter, so I encourage people to subscribe to that. And right now, I'm in the phase of trying to build this community, a community of like-minded individuals who are willing to take some responsibility for their own healthcare. That's key. If you're not willing to take any responsibility for your healthcare, you just want to go to the doctor and get medicine, that's fine. No judgment, but gratefully well is not going to help you. So you have to be willing to, look at yourself or do some work, let's call it. And they're looking for resources, looking for support, looking for a community of like-minded individuals who are looking to this more holistic approach to healthcare. Then I encourage them to subscribe to the free newsletter that build become part of the community. I'm also started giving master classes, sort of an introduction to Gratefully Well, with giving some tools, and so I did the first one a couple weeks ago. That'll be probably recurring, probably once a month. And then there'll be some additional parts of the community where we have, the ability to probably have at least a once a month um, uh, workshop, let's call it, where we get together and I'll be there and we can, questions and answers. We'll present something and things like that. But I think it's all about, for me, building the community as first, and then being able to develop these, workshops, both virtual and live. I would like to do some live ones as well, to help people begin to understand, the importance of this. And the people that it should be attracted are, excuse me, it's really for anyone, but certainly if they're holistically minded, already healthy, they can certainly benefit from it. But the people with the medically unexplained symptoms, I think, tend to benefit a lot. But also patients with known chronic diseases like, diabetes or heart disease or high blood pressure or autoimmune disease is another one where I think people, if they can buy into this, and there can be a significant benefit to them. They would also be, benefit from all this. But once again, just to emphasize, there is a taking of responsibility of some portion of your own healthcare. In the West, we tend to give that responsibility all to the healthcare provider, be it physician or nurse practitioner, whatever it is. You have to be willing to take some responsibility yourself.
Absolutely. I think that's such an empowering conclusion to this conversation, listeners. And Julius, I'll make sure that I have all the details in the show notes for our listeners. And um, thank you. Thank you so much for once again reminding us that medicine is most powerful, but when it expands beyond physical. So thank you so much once again, Julius. And to all our listeners, if you have ever felt dismissed because your symptoms they didn't show up on a test, know that your experience is real and there are options out there. There are pathways like the Gratefully Well model that honor both the science of the brain and the mystery of the heart. So until then, this has been Cosmic Confluence, and I'm your host, Sana, signing off. Thank you.